Boss Lady, please tell us what is going on with employment equity right now.
A lot of people have been asking about what's going on with employment equity and the changes to the Employment Equity Act, and I noticed that there's a lot of nervousness and tension going on. So here are the highlights. Okay. Effective 1st of September 2023, the Employment Equity Act has changed significantly. So firstly, the definition of designated employers has shifted, which is good news for people who have less than 50 employees. If you have less than 50 employees, regardless of how big your company is in terms of turnover, you are no longer considered a designated employer, and therefore you don't have to report on employment equity anymore. Right, so it takes the pressure off a little bit. The second aspect is that compliance with employment equity for those designated employers means working towards achieving prescribed targets over the next 5 years. So the big change here is that historically, companies were allowed to set their own targets in terms of employment equity. Now the Department of Employment and Labour have specified what those targets should be according to which sector you belong to, according to the different sectors. Right. So again, not a huge change, but it does mean that for every company that has more than 50 employees, you have to have absolute clarity on your recruitment practices, your recruitment policy. You need to have absolute clarity on how you aim to achieve these employment equity targets to achieve a representative workforce in your sector. Right. The other big change is that in order to prove compliance for purposes of your BEE audit or for the public sector tender process, you need to obtain what is called a certificate of compliance. So employment equity compliance is just one aspect of the certificate of compliance. The other aspects are that you have to be compliant or up to date with your CIPC returns. You need to be up to date with your tax compliance. You need to have no instances of a finding against you with regards to unfair discrimination in the past 12 months. So you essentially just need to have a clean record of compliance across your entire business in order for you to qualify for a certificate of compliance from the Department of Employment and Labour.
And I did have a question about them setting goals of employment. How does that look like for each company size, small, medium, large business?
I don't have the specific targets, but what's happened is that historically, so the Employment Equity Act was first published in 1998. There have been various amendments to the Act over the years, but the intention of the Employment Equity Act was that every company in South Africa would work towards achieving a representative workforce in terms of race, gender, and the inclusion of people with disabilities, right? Companies were allowed to set their own targets. So the prescription in the Act was develop a 5-year plan, give yourself targets, and then work towards achieving those targets. And unfortunately, what's happened since 1998 is that companies would give themselves targets and then nobody would achieve them. So what's happened is that in an attempt to now try and enforce, to some extent, diverse workforces or the achievement of diverse workforces, the Department of Employment and Labour have said, so we'll give you targets. And the targets are based on the demographic of the economically active population. So the economically active population are people between the ages of 15 and 64 who are actively working or looking for work, right? So they're economically active. In South Africa, at least 80% of our economically active population is Black African, right? With approximately 50% split between male and female. So the intention is that when you are setting your targets, you will, Stats SA and the Department of Labour publish the economically active population statistics on a quarterly basis, that you'll work towards achieving that kind of representation in your workforce.
And if they say that on the 1st of September it's going to be like this from now on, how does a business pick up from there?
So essentially what that means is now that 2023 is your year zero. Any employment equity plans or strategies that you've developed in the past become null and void, and we all have to start from zero again. So we plan over the next 5-year period to so what a business practically does, right, is every business has some sort of idea of what's going to happen over the next 5 years, whether you are strategizing for growth or strategizing to stay the same. You have some idea of how many people leave your business and how many new people come in on a yearly basis. And what the requirement is that you take all of that information and you now plan the next 5 years in terms of your workforce, right? And you understand that if a company is not planning to grow the workforce, the employment equity plan needs to reflect that in order to achieve our targets, we are reliant on the fact that people will resign and be leaving. And so we will prioritize the recruitment of certain categories of people according to the employment equity targets. The challenge there, obviously, is that you might not find people apply for positions that suit your demographic requirement for achieving the employment equity targets. The practical thing to do there is you need to be able to demonstrate that you are unable to hire that demographic of person, right? I mean, there are lots of variables in this whole landscape, but you have to be able to demonstrate that you tried.
Does this look like what you just said, proving that you couldn't attain this standard? Does that look like showing the department that, look, we put out that we're looking for this specific person and none of them came? Or
so, and this is an interesting thing, right? Because according to our constitution, we are not allowed to unfairly discriminate. So you cannot in a job advert publish that we will only hire white females for this role, right? Because that is blatant unfair discrimination. But what you can say in a job advert is that we will be hiring in terms of our employment equity strategy, right? And that allows anybody of any race, gender to apply for the position. And so your first point of call is that if you have nobody of the required race or gender applying for your position, and you can prove that because here are the CVs of everybody that applied. And you'll also be able to demonstrate if people of the sort of right race and gender did apply, but they did not necessarily meet the qualifications you were looking for. You will have your job adverts, the criteria you're looking for, and the CVs of all the people. The idea is just to keep adequate records of everything and being mindful of how you undertake a recruitment process to offer everybody equal opportunity.
And then shifting our focus to the individual, what does the act look like for people looking for work?
So that's an interesting question, right? Because what essentially is being said from an intentional perspective is that we understand that certain groups and categories of people remain locked out of the labor force for whatever reason, right? Whether it's a social dynamic or a class dynamic or even just a race dynamic. There is also a fundamental understanding that recruitment sometimes happens through formal channels, but a lot of the time, especially for smaller and medium-sized businesses, recruitment does not happen through formal channels, right? Because the formal recruitment process is quite expensive for small businesses. So what the changes of employment equity, I'd like to read the changes in the Employment Equity Act to mean is that there's a general awareness of these barriers to being hired that exist in South Africa, and we are taking concerted effort to start removing those barriers by placing extra pressure on businesses, especially businesses with larger workforces, right? For individuals, it means that you can almost expect now that there'll be a widening of opportunities because companies are more compelled to now advertise those positions, right? So the idea is to look for the opportunities, right?
And then from your own personal feedback, does this change to the act? What are some advantages and disadvantages that you find?
I think the biggest disadvantage, or I suppose downside, is that it's created a lot of tension and fear in the marketplace. And we know that when people are afraid or unhappy with the change, that creates a lot of uncertainty and general negativity. In reality, though, this change has been a long time coming, and practically those companies that have already been quite intentional about their BEE strategies, their broad-based Black economic empowerment strategies, and have been scoring positively in terms of their management control and employment equity demographic. They probably have already started imposing internal targets very much aligned to what the Employment Equity Act is going to prescribe in terms of targets. What we're seeing is a sort of closing of the gap between the employment equity policy and the broad-based Black economic empowerment policy, right? So all we're doing is essentially closing that gap, which means effectively for companies that have been complying, there's no change, right? Maybe a little bit of a slight change in administration requirements, but no effective change in terms of their strategy. It does mean that companies who have not been intentionally complying now need to be more intentional about their strategies, which is fundamentally a good thing, I think, because we know that when you have a defined intention, then achieving that intention is far easier. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, that is all the questions I have come up with in this short period of time. Do you have any other comments that you would like to let people know about the Amendment Act, to the Act?
So firstly, I don't think the changes are not enough to spark fear and dissatisfaction with our political landscape. I think that from a business perspective, they're fairly easy to address internally, but should anybody want to have a conversation about employment equity, they're welcome to contact us and we'll happily have the conversation.